Today we're going to talk about the questions that were assigned for the last section of our Who is Israel portion of this course. There were two topics that I mentioned would be a little bit more challenging because they went beyond what we did in lecture and attended to some details that were found in the extra readings for the course. The first topic, topic B, had to do with the question of why it is we see Joseph and his brothers reconcile one to the other two different times, once in chapter 45 and once in chapter 50, a somewhat peculiar literary feature. Before jumping immediately, though, into that issue, I wanted to attend to one other question, not related to the question I asked you, but nicely brought up in the reading by Uriel Simon and also addressed directly by the two texts that you were to have read for this question, that is Genesis 45 and Genesis 50. There we read something really quite peculiar, and it's the grounds for the forgiveness in both scenes. Joseph remarks in chapter 45 that even though the brothers had intended to do him harm or to send him indeed to Egypt, it was not indeed so much their agency that was the issue at stake, but rather God's. So he says in chapter 45 verse 8, "So it was not you who sent me here." You might have thought you had done that by selling me to the Ishmaelites to be brought into Egypt. Rather, Joseph says, God is the one who brought me here. And then he says the same thing in chapter 50. The very famous lines Joseph addresses to his brothers, "Fear not, for am I in place of God? You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Simon says with respect to these two verses something very interesting. This has to do with the doctrine of what we call divine providence, how God directs human affairs. On the very first page of his essay, he writes that this story is a story of divine providence, telling us how God guided the protagonists' footsteps to the place he had appointed for them. This is primarily a theological, or rather perhaps ironical tale. And here he recites Proverbs 19, verse 21. "Many designs are in a man's mind, but it is the Lord's plan that is accomplished." Again, this proverb nicely raising the issue of what is the relationship between what do we intend and what does God accomplish by our intentions. And then Simon goes on to say, on the face of it, divine determinism is inconsistent with human freedom. If man is merely an instrument in the execution of God's plan, he should surely bear no responsibility for his actions. Conversely, if he possesses freedom of action, one might think that God does not govern him, but only responds to his actions. This is not the case. In the story of Joseph and his brothers, divine providence achieves its goals despite the fact that the subjects of the story possess free choice, and even through their agency. So a very important theological point indeed, that God governs human history, governs the story of Joseph and his brothers, but in doing so, he doesn't overpower their human agency. All the figures in this story act out of their own free will. Okay, having addressed that very important topic, ever so briefly, let's turn to the issue at hand, which is the question, why do we have two reconciliation stories at the conclusion of the Joseph story? In chapter 45, the first 8 verses, the reconciliation that occurs between the brothers and Joseph, and this indeed recalls what Judah had said just a chapter earlier, takes place because of a deference to the father. As I mentioned, chapter 44, the chapter that immediately precedes the famous speech of Judah that we looked at in some detail, there Judah's interest in sacrificing himself for Benjamin is predicated solely on his love and esteem, even respect for his father. We see the same issue of respect or concern for the father here in chapter 45 in the very way Joseph will introduce and then conclude his remarks to his brothers. When he opens up and identifies himself to his brothers in verse 3, he says, "I am Joseph," not "do not worry" or "I'm so glad to see you again," but rather, "Is my father alive?" And then when he concludes his speech, having forgiven his brothers, he immediately returns again to the subject of his father. "Make haste and go up to my father," Joseph says, "and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry.'" So this raises an interesting question. We've seen an enormous change in Joseph and his brothers over the course of these chapters. We've moved a considerable degree from the animosity that concerned chapter 37 to the reconciliation, Judah expressing it in chapter 44 and now Joseph expressing it in chapter 45. But there's a slight problem here. The reconciliation that exists between the brothers is all configured or ordered over against the value of the father within the family. The brothers overcome their jealousies or animosities between one another because of respect for the father's preferences. Well, this raises a very interesting and important question. What if, or what will happen when the father dies? And that's precisely what happens in chapter 50. Jacob has died, and so it's altogether natural that the brothers would worry. Did Joseph treat us nicely all these years because, in fact, he's reconciled to us? Or was that behavior of Joseph towards us simply a concession of his love towards his father? In other words, all these years Joseph has been harboring a desire to achieve vengeance against his brothers, but is held back on those desires because of his love for his father, realizing his father could not put up with Joseph acting that way. But now, with the father having passed away, Joseph could, the brothers reason, take vengeance now on his brothers without hurting or harming his father. So the issue now really is, how deep is the reconciliation that we've watched between the siblings? Is it ordered simply to the love of the father, or does it reach beyond that? And what we see in chapter 50 is indeed the reconciliation between the brothers does reach beyond that. If in chapter 45 the reconciliation, we might say, is due to a deference to the human father, the reconciliation in chapter 50 is due to deference to, we might say, a divine father. And this raises perhaps one more question, maybe in the end unanswerable, and that would be, what is the subjective state of Joseph in chapter 50 with respect to his brothers? One option is to see the reconciliation for exactly that in chapter 50. Joseph and his brothers have let bygones be bygones. They now love one another completely, and everything has been put in the past. On the other hand, one could read the story slightly differently. Remember, the brothers tried to kill Joseph. This is a rather significant sin. I think all of us would agree. Can Joseph simply forget that? Can that disappear? Sometimes when human beings display that kind of rage against another, it's impossible, no matter how long one lives, to forget completely the evil someone intended against you. In chapter 50, I think it's possible to read this story in a way that would see Joseph still harboring some reservations about his brothers, the reconciliation perhaps not being completely achieved, but rather what's significant about this chapter is Joseph realizes that whatever he might feel inside, he's not free to act on those human feelings for vengeance because of the deference he has to the plans God has achieved through this family. I think in some senses, that's the more powerful way to read this story.